The sun hadn't yet broken over the French coastline when the technical officers gathered around the crumpled papers spread across their desks at the observation post. It was late in August of 1944, just after 6 in the morning, and these German specialists stationed with Flak Regiment 155W along the Pas de Calais were staring at numbers that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. The mathematics defied every lesson they'd absorbed during their training at Luftwaffe technical schools throughout the Reich. 82% destroyed. Someone must have made a calculation error. This figure couldn't possibly be accurate. Through their field telescopes, these observers had been watching something that completely contradicted every assurance their intelligence services had provided about what the Allies were capable of doing with anti-aircraft defences. The flying bombs they'd launched toward London during those pre-dawn hours were being obliterated at rates that had no rational explanation. These weren't being chased down by fighter planes making risky pursuit manoeuvres, and they weren't getting tangled up in the cables of barrage balloons either. Instead, they were being destroyed by anti-aircraft fire over the coastal gun belt. Artillery shells were exploding with accuracy that seemed physically impossible around these missiles, somehow detonating in their vicinity rather than needing to score actual direct hits. At the headquarters of Flak Regiment 155W, housed in the Château d'Auteuil, Oberst Max Wachtel received these incoming reports with mounting concern. Wachtel commanded the entire V1 offensive, and the statistics he was seeing told an increasingly disturbing story. During the course of the German flying bomb campaign, the percentage of these weapons being destroyed by the coastal gun belt had climbed from a mere 17% back in June all the way up to 74% by the closing days of August. On one particularly extraordinary day during that final week of the month, the destruction rate hit 82%. This marked the beginning of what would become the most profound technological shock that the Wehrmacht's weapons scientists would encounter during the entire war. What neither Wachtel nor any other German scientist understood at that moment was that they were witnessing the deployment of one of the Second World War's most jealously guarded secrets. This was technology so revolutionary, so advanced, that it enjoyed protection at exactly the same security level as the atomic bomb project itself. The proximity fuse, which the Allies had deliberately coded as the VT or variable time fuse to disguise its true nature, was systematically dismantling the Führer's terror weapon with a precision that German physics insisted shouldn't be possible to achieve. The entire saga had actually begun 10 weeks earlier, on the 13th of June in 1944, precisely 1 week after the D-Day landings. In direct response to the Allied invasion forces landing in Normandy, the German leadership had finally unleashed what they'd been promising for so long, their Vergeltungswaffe, their vengeance weapon, against the British capital. At 25 minutes past 4 in the morning on that June 13th, the first V1 came down on London, striking Grove Road in the Bow District. The impact destroyed a railway bridge along with nearby homes. 6 people lost their lives, 30 suffered injuries, and 200 found themselves suddenly homeless. This weapon was the product of years of German development work, essentially a pilotless aircraft driven by an Argus pulse jet engine, specifically the AS-109-014 model. It carried 850 kilograms of Amatol explosive and flew at 640 kilometers per hour. The world had never seen anything quite like it before. It was, in essence, the first operational cruise missile, and the German High Command firmly believed this weapon would force Britain to capitulate. Major Walter Dornberger, who headed the V-weapons program at the Peenemünde Research Facility, had run calculations showing that even with a conservative 25% success rate, the V1 would deliver more explosive tonnage to London than the entire Blitz of 1940 and 1941 combined. Each individual V1 cost approximately 5,000 Reichsmarks to manufacture, which was just a fraction of what it cost to send a manned bomber on a mission, and it came with zero risk to aircrew. At the Peenemünde Army Research Centre, German scientists had every reason to feel confident about their work. They'd successfully developed advanced rocket technology. They'd created operational jet aircraft, and now they'd fielded the world's first cruise missile. Dr. Robert Lusser, the engineer who designed the V-1's guidance and control system, had calculated that Allied interception was nearly impossible to achieve. The flying bomb travelled at 640 kilometers per hour while flying at varying altitudes anywhere between 600 and 2,700 meters. British fighters needed to exceed 650 kilometers per hour just to catch up with them. To actually destroy one, pilots had to close to within 200 meters, which meant risking their own destruction from the resulting explosion. As for anti-aircraft fire, the probability of scoring a direct hit on such a small, fast-moving target had been calculated at less than 1 in 10,000 shells fired. This wasn't propaganda or wishful thinking, but rather solid ballistic science based on established principles. Conventional time-fused shells required accurate prediction of the target's future position, precise mathematical calculations, manual setting of the fuse, and perfect timing of the detonation. Given the V-1's speed, gunners had perhaps 30 seconds from initial detection to actual engagement. It was an incredibly difficult problem. Oberst Max Wachtel, commanding Flak Regiment 155W, understood these limitations from experience on both sides of anti-aircraft warfare. Throughout the campaign, German forces would launch 9,521 V-1 missiles from ground sites aimed at England, with approximately another 15,000 fired at various other targets, bringing the total number of V-1s deployed throughout the war to roughly 25,000 units. Within just days of the first launches, troubling reports started reaching German intelligence offices. British anti-aircraft defences were adapting with suspicious speed. By late June, the interception rate had climbed from 10% to 24%. This was higher than predicted, certainly, but still within the realm of what could be explained. Then came July, and the statistics became completely inexplicable. German technical officers who were monitoring the weapon's effectiveness began noticing that British guns were claiming V-1 kills while expending impossibly low quantities of ammunition. Observers stationed on the French coast witnessed V-1s flying steadily toward England, then suddenly finding themselves surrounded by flak bursts before tumbling from the sky, despite the fact that the explosions were occurring too far away to be direct hits. Unknown to German intelligence analysts, they were witnessing proximity fuses in action, technology that transformed near misses into actual kills. This technology had already been operational in the Pacific Theatre since January of 1943, when the USS Helena shot down a Japanese dive bomber using shells that exploded automatically when they sensed proximity to their targets. The failure of German intelligence was absolutely comprehensive in this regard. The Oslo Report of November 1939 had actually mentioned Allied research into proximity fuses, but German scientists had dismissed this information as disinformation meant to mislead them. Germany had itself attempted to develop similar technology. Over 30 different designs had been researched and tested, but not a single one had achieved operational status. German engineers had eventually concluded that proximity fuses were simply impossible to create. The technical challenges appeared completely insurmountable. How could you miniaturize radio transmitter receivers small enough to fit inside artillery shells? How could you make vacuum tubes survive 20,000 times the force of gravity during firing? How could you create batteries that remained dormant for years, yet activated instantly when needed? How could you achieve mass production of something so complex? Yet by August of 1944, American factories were churning out 40,000 proximity fuses every single day. During that final week of August in 1944, the proximity fuse achieved its maximum effectiveness against the V-1 threat. The British had completely reorganized their entire anti-aircraft defense system. Gun batteries employed American SCR-584 radar units for automatic target tracking. More crucially, they were firing shells equipped with VT fuses that had been specifically modified to counter the V-1 threat. The Royal Artillery and RAF Regiment had been redeployed from their positions in the North Downs to the south coast, creating a concentrated gun belt. This coastal positioning served a critical security function, ensuring that any dewed shells would fall harmlessly into the sea rather than on land where German forces might recover them. As V-1s crossed over the English coast, they entered what had effectively become a kill zone where advanced technology trumped statistical probability. The SCR 584 radar systems automatically locked onto incoming targets, calculated their trajectories with mechanical precision, and fed firing solutions directly to the gun crews. The proximity fuse itself contained miniature radio transmitters built using specially developed tubes created by Sylvania Electric and Western Electric. When the reflected radio signals indicated close proximity to a target, Theratron switches triggered the detonators, sending steel fragments tearing through the V-1's hull and fuel tanks. On the peak day in late August, coastal guns successfully destroyed 82% of incoming V-1s, an achievement that German engineers considered physically impossible according to all established principles of ballistics. Reports indicating 82% interception rates triggered crisis meetings at German headquarters facilities. Wachtel suspected sabotage somewhere in the production or launch chain. Emergency inspections were ordered and conducted, but found absolutely nothing wrong with the missiles themselves. Test firings conducted over German-controlled territory showed completely normal performance. The problem manifested itself exclusively when the weapons were fired against British defences. German experts eventually concluded that the British must have developed revolutionary anti-aircraft systems of some kind, but they couldn't determine any specifics without capturing actual examples of whatever technology was being employed. They attempted varying their tactics in response. Different altitudes were tried, larger salvos were launched simultaneously, night launches were conducted, and they attempted to exploit weather conditions. Nothing worked. The kill rate remained devastatingly high. At Peenemünde, scientists were forced to confront an uncomfortable conclusion. If the Allies had somehow managed to develop working proximity fuses, they had achieved something that Germany's best minds had determined was impossible. German efforts to uncover this secret intensified significantly, but failed completely to penetrate the security surrounding the program. The proximity fuse's security was nearly perfect in its execution. Production was compartmentalized across 110 separate factories. Individual workers knew only their specific assigned tasks. Even the name itself, variable time, was deliberately misleading, suggesting a conventional timed fuse rather than revealing the proximity sensing technology. By 1944, a substantial portion of American electronics industry capacity had been devoted to fuse production. 22 million proximity fuses would be manufactured by the war's end, at a cost exceeding $1 billion in the 1940s. The Crosley Corporation alone produced over 5 million fuses, nearly a quarter of total production output. The numbers revealed a staggering industrial mismatch between the two sides. While Germany struggled to produce V-1s using forced labour under terrible conditions, America had transformed its entire electronics industry specifically for fuse production. Peak daily production reached 40,000 units. Manufacturing costs dropped dramatically from $732 per unit in 1942 down to just $18 by 1945. The Crosley Corporation, which had manufactured radios and refrigerators before the war, employed 10,000 workers at peak and was producing 16,000 fuses daily. Sylvania Electric dedicated its entire vacuum tube research division to developing ruggedized components capable of surviving artillery firing, ultimately producing 400,000 miniaturized tubes every day. The contrast between the two industrial approaches was absolute. Germany was handcrafting weapons in limited numbers using slave labor. America was mass-producing revolutionary technology at unprecedented scale using voluntary workers. Monthly American proximity fuse production actually exceeded the total German V-1 production for the entire war. Think about that for a moment. Every single month, America was producing more fuses than Germany produced V1s during the entire conflict. The proximity fuse itself represented extraordinary engineering achievement. The device had to survive being fired from a gun, which meant withstanding 20,000 times the force of gravity during acceleration, spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute, and enduring extreme temperature variations. Sylvania developed miniature vacuum tubes based on hearing aid designs, but massively reinforced to survive these incredible forces. The batteries had to remain dormant for years of storage, yet activate instantly when needed. The fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter that broadcast signals continuously while in flight. When reflections indicated proximity to large metallic objects, electronic circuits triggered the detonation sequence. This seemingly simple concept required solving problems that German engineers genuinely considered impossible to overcome. Quality control procedures were unprecedented in their rigor. Every single fuse underwent multiple inspection and testing procedures. Random samples were actually fired in test guns to verify performance under real conditions. Rejection rates remained below 2%, which demonstrated remarkable manufacturing precision achieved at truly massive scale. By September of 1944, the V1 offensive had been effectively neutralized as a strategic threat. Of the 9,521 V1s launched from ground sites against Britain, only about 2,500 actually reached London to cause damage. Germany shifted tactics, attempting more night launches and accelerating development of the V2 rocket, which flew too fast for any interception. But these desperate measures couldn't achieve meaningful strategic impact. The V1 had become a costly failure, consuming resources that were desperately needed on other fronts. The German failure to detect the existence of proximity fuses represented one of history's greatest intelligence disasters. Despite maintaining extensive spy networks and possessing significant technical expertise, German intelligence services never grasped what they were actually facing. The program remained completely secret throughout the entire war. Not a single intact proximity fuse fell into German hands during the Phi-1 campaign, despite thousands being fired. Remarkably, during the Battle of the Bulge, German forces actually captured an American ammunition dump that contained proximity-fused shells, but they never recognized what they had. Their fundamental assumption that such devices were impossible to build blinded them to the evidence literally in their own hands. After Germany's surrender, interrogations of captured personnel revealed their complete ignorance about proximity fuses. Oberst Max Wachtel told Allied interrogation officers that they had suspected improved radar systems or perhaps faster-setting mechanical fuses, but nobody had ever imagined self-detonating shells guided by miniature radio systems. German scientists who were shown captured American proximity fuses expressed genuine disbelief at what they were seeing. They couldn't comprehend how vacuum tubes could survive the acceleration forces, how batteries could remain viable for years, how circuits could continue functioning after the violent shock of gunfiring. They estimated that Germany was at least 10 years behind American technology in this particular field. Dr. Merle Tuve, who led the proximity fuse development effort at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, later reflected that their success came from systematic collaboration between scientists, engineers, and production workers, something that totalitarian systems fundamentally couldn't achieve as effectively. The proximity fuse demonstrated conclusively that the Second World War's ultimate outcome was being determined in laboratories and factories just as much as on battlefields. While Germany pursued exotic wonder weapons that required enormous resources for limited production, America focused on what could be called multiplicative technologies, improvements that enhanced the effectiveness of existing weapons. The proximity fuse made every single anti-aircraft gun 5 to 10 times more effective than it had been previously. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal stated publicly that the proximity fuse had helped blaze the trail to Japan, noting that without the protection this ingenious device had given to surface ships of the fleet, the westward Pacific push could not have been executed so swiftly, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater than it was. The V1 program relied heavily on slave labor drawn from concentration camps. Tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners died in the underground factories where V1s were being manufactured. Meanwhile, American workers were voluntarily working overtime shifts for premium wages, not knowing exactly what they were producing, but understanding that it was important to the war effort. At Sylvania's facility in Ipswich, over 5,000 women worked 12-hour shifts producing specialised components. They only discovered after the war ended that they had helped save London from the terror weapons. The proximity fuse secret was maintained completely throughout the conflict. British anti-aircraft crews firing the special ammunition didn't know what made their shells so effective. They simply had special ammunition with extremely strict accounting requirements. Every single proximity-fused shell fired at V1s was carefully tracked and documented. Any unexploded shells were immediately secured by special teams. Naval vessels patrolled the English Channel specifically to prevent German forces from recovering any duds that might have fallen into the water. This extraordinary secrecy actually cost Allied lives in other theatres. Allied ground forces couldn't be permitted to use proximity-fused artillery shells until December of 1944, despite the fact that they would have been devastatingly effective against German counterattacks. Thousands of soldiers died in battles during the autumn of 1944 because the technology was considered too secret to risk in ground combat where German forces might capture unexploded examples. Yet using them against V1s over water was considered justified. London's survival during the invasion period was considered absolutely crucial to maintaining morale and operational capability. For Germany, the V1 program drained critical resources while achieving minimal strategic impact relative to the investment. Launching approximately 25,000 V1s cost millions of Reichsmarks and diverted resources away from fighter aircraft and anti-tank weapons that were desperately needed on the rapidly shrinking fronts. The program's heavy reliance on slave labor added a moral dimension to its failure. The proximity fuse was defeating weapons that had been built through tremendous human suffering, a contrast that was only fully understood after the war ended. The proximity fuse represented a fundamental transformation in how warfare functioned. Victory came through superior engineering and production capacity, rather than through individual weapon superiority or tactical brilliance. It proved decisively that modern warfare had become a contest of industrial systems and productive capacity, not just a clash of military forces on battlefields. Before being used to save Pacific Fleet ships and enable the final defeat of Japan, the proximity fuse saved London from sustained bombardment. The Germans, watching their V1s fall from the sky, never understood why it was happening. The technology defeating them was literally inconceivable within their existing scientific framework and assumptions. The transformation in defensive capability was genuinely dramatic. Before proximity fuses were introduced, destroying a single V1 required an average of 2,500 heavy anti-aircraft shells. With proximity fuses, the average dropped to under 100 shells per kill. The gun belt's interception rate rose from 17% to 82% in just 10 weeks. This wasn't achieved through improved courage or better training of gun crews, but purely through the mass production of advanced technology on a scale that Germany couldn't match or even comprehend was possible. America had mobilized its entire electronics industry for this effort, employed over 80,000 workers in the program, and invested over $1 billion to produce those 22 million fuses. The proximity fuse was finally declassified in September of 1945 after the war ended. The War Department announcement began by stating that this was one of the most important weapons developed during the war, surpassed in effectiveness only by the atomic bomb itself. For German scientists who had spent months puzzling over the V1 failures, this revelation brought both understanding and a sense of humiliation. They had been defeated not through superior strategy or greater courage, but by industrial capacity that they hadn't imagined was possible to achieve. Post-war interviews with captured German scientists revealed the depth of their shock. They had genuinely believed that their V1 represented the absolute pinnacle of weapons technology. Learning that it had been defeated by mass-produced electronics costing less than $20 each was devastating to their professional pride. They had lost not to superior warriors, but to assembly lines staffed largely by women working in American factories. The technology developed for the proximity fuse evolved into modern air defense systems, radar altimeters, and electronic warfare capabilities that remain in use today. For Germany's former weapons scientists, it remained a permanent reminder of their wartime blindness and miscalculation. The proximity fuse proved conclusively that in modern warfare, the ability to mass-produce good technology matters far more than crafting perfect individual weapons in small numbers. Germany produced brilliant individual weapons that were marvels of engineering. America produced effective weapons by the millions. On that remarkable day in late August of 1944, when proximity fuses destroyed 82% of incoming V1s, the fundamental nature of warfare changed forever. The Germans launching their vengeance weapons across the Channel never knew what invisible technology was systematically defeating them. They had done everything right according to their understanding of physics and engineering. They'd developed genuinely advanced weapons, trained elite technical crews, and achieved significant technological breakthroughs. Yet they were being defeated by mass-produced electronics that they couldn't even imagine existed. The proximity fuse saved London through thousands upon thousands of small explosions, each one guided by technology that German science had declared impossible. It represented industrial democracy's triumph over totalitarian engineering, mass production over handcrafted perfection, multiplied simple solutions over complex wonder weapons. The Germans never discovered what was hitting their V1s as they fell burning from the sky, defeated by a secret they couldn't conceive and an industrial might they couldn't hope to match. The proximity fuse had transformed the Führer's vengeance weapon into London's salvation, and the Germans never understood how or why this was happening until long after it ceased to matter. In the final analysis, America's greatest victory wasn't won on battlefields with rifles and tanks, but rather in factories where millions of workers, many of them women who didn't even know what they were making, produced the tiny electronic devices that saved an entire city and transformed the nature of warfare forever. That 82% interception rate achieved during late August of 1944 stood as permanent proof that in modern warfare, industrial capacity and production capability could defeat any wonder weapon, regardless of how ingenious its design might be. The proximity fuse was more than just another weapon in the arsenal. It served as concrete evidence that democracy's ability to mobilize science and industry could systematically overcome tyranny's forced brilliance and slave labor. And the Germans, watching their supposedly perfect weapons fall from the sky day after day, never understood why this was happening. They never grasped that they had already lost a war that their leaders kept insisting they were still winning. The proximity fuse was the invisible hand that knocked their vengeance from the sky, the secret weapon they never detected, never captured, never understood. It was American industrial might made manifest in miniature form, 22 million tiny radios that turned the Channel coast into an impenetrable barrier, saving countless lives in London while German scientists stood puzzled on the French coast, unable to comprehend the mathematics of their own defeat.